I was without a deacon this morning at the 10:30 Mass. I like having a deacon. It's just better. I just like I just like it. Okay. I had a panic attack, though, this morning because I looked down at the gospel in the book, and I thought I prepared the homily for the wrong gospel, okay? And man, there's nothing that freaks a preacher out more than that. And I was like, this is why I need a deacon. All right, it was okay, though. It was okay. You guys doing okay today? You with me? All right? Yes? Okay. We're all still relishing the Browns' win? How about that, huh? All right. There's an applause. Okay. All right, so let's dive in. 25th Sunday, we got a lot to talk about tonight. Beautiful, beautiful readings that we have. So, all right, we have 4 Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 2 of the 4 were written by eyewitnesses, and 2 of them were not written by eyewitnesses. They were written by friends of eyewitnesses, people who were not direct apostles, right? So John and Matthew were the eyewitnesses of the events of Jesus' ministry. And then you've got Luke and Mark. They were the ones who gathered the source material from those who knew Jesus, from the apostles, and then put together Gospels for the Christian community, right? Now, the repeated and unanimous testimony of all the early church fathers, from St. Irenaeus to Papias to John Chrysostom, all of the early church fathers, they all agree that Mark's gospel, the author of Mark's gospel, is the figure who shows up in the Acts of the Apostles, a guy by the name of John Mark, who is the traveling companion of Peter, right? So Peter had this guy named John Mark with him. So Mark's gospel, the church fathers say, is an accurate record of Peter's teaching, an accurate record of Peter's vantage point on the story, if you will, right? So Mark's gospel is told through the lens, right, if you can think of it that way, through the lens of Peter and Peter's experience, which is very significant, right? So why am I telling you this? Well, because this gospel that we just heard, in all likelihood, it was recorded by Mark about 30 or so years after the resurrection, right? So about 30 or so years after the events of Holy Week, after the events of the passion, death, resurrection of the Lord, in Rome, at the time that Nero was launching one of the greatest and first persecutions of the Christian church, right? Nero, who again was one of those psychotic despots of history who, there was a major fire that wiped out a third of the city, and he was looking for a scapegoat. And he found one easily in this new uprising, this new community known as the Christians. And he was blaming them, right? So here you have Mark in the heart of Rome, in the belly of the beast, with Peter, who's, months to a year or so away from his own martyrdom, recording this gospel at a time where, Peter's recollecting to this season of their own formation 30 years prior, where at the time he and the other apostles really had no idea yet who Jesus was. They didn't really understand what this was all about. They had no idea what all of this was about. They had no idea what was really going on, which I think is a very interesting thing to remember, right? Like the Gospels weren't written chronologically in like Mark wasn't there recording while the events were happening, right? These are the recollections 30 years after the fact, which is very significant. It's very significant. Like the gospel we just heard happened at a time before the apostles began to learn that life, because of Jesus, life comes about through the passageway of death, through the narrow way of death. The victory, strangely enough, comes about through what appears for all the world as defeat. That triumph comes through what looks like catastrophe and failure. Like this was before they learned that the world is upside down, that for the Christian, the way up is down. The way to ascend is through descending. They hadn't really learned all this yet. And so Peter here, he's giving John Mark, his traveling companion, a window into where he and the other apostles were just kind of at this season of their time with Jesus. So you have Jesus with the apostles. He predicts again his passion. He lets them know that we're heading eventually to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man, a title he gets from the book of Daniel, the Son of Man, referring to himself, is going to be handed over. He's going to be killed. And on the third day, he's going to rise from the dead, right? So he just tells them this is what's happening. And then Mark records, this is one of my favorite lines, but they did not understand the saying. They did not understand the saying. Again, remember, Mark is being written through the vantage point of Peter. So I'm picturing Peter telling this story to Mark, and I picture Peter saying like, yeah, man, we had no clue what that was about. We had no clue what he was talking about. So they continue their journey. They make their way to Galilee. They make their way to Capernaum, which is the hometown of Peter and Andrew and James and John, right? Hometown heroes. And all along the way, it says that they were discussing. The actual word is arguing. And the Greek gives a sense of like really boisterous kind of debate, okay? They were really arguing amongst themselves over the topic of who in their group is the greatest. Who in their group is the greatest? I loved imagining this week, just like sitting in prayer and trying to imagine like this whole journey and this conversation, right? I mean, because like ostensibly, like where was Jesus? Like if you picture them walking this long journey, let's just say it was 20 kilometers. Them walking 20 kilometers through the Judean countryside, the wilderness, right, making their way from town to town. Like, there's this group of men who are debating amongst themselves who's the greatest. Like, where do you think Jesus was in the midst of them? Like, you think he was walking in front of them? Think he was behind them? Like, where do you picture him? Like, that's just, I know it doesn't seem like an important detail, but if this is a real event, if this is a real thing that happened, like, where do you picture Jesus in this story? And how do you picture this conversation going down, right? Like, they must have been, like, referring to a certain set of criteria, right, for how they thought they were going to measure each other in terms of greatness, right? Like, they had their own set of criteria for determining who was the greatest. I can imagine Judas, right? Imagine Judas offering this, as an example, like, well, like, he gave me the money bag, right? Did he give any of you the money bag? He entrusted me with the financial responsibility of our little group here. Like, clearly, amongst all of us, I must be the greatest. He's shaking the coins, right? Clearly, I must be the greatest. He gave me this responsibility, right? Or I remember him thinking, like, or I picture another scene where maybe it's one of the two apostles who were sent to that village of Samaria ahead of the rest to prepare for Jesus' coming. I picture them saying, well, like, he didn't entrust you guys with that mission. He entrusted us with that mission. Clearly, he thinks we are, a greater impact, greater importance. We can do more. We can offer more. Like, therefore, because he's entrusting us with these sorts of things, we must be the greatest. Or I picture John, the beloved apostle, right? I picture John saying, like, I don't know, he's constantly calling me to his side, and we have these deep, deep conversations. He entrusts powerful thoughts and revelations to me. Like, he must see something in me that he doesn't see in you guys. Like, I don't want to brag, but I think I must be the greatest, right? And then I picture Peter, of course, Peter full of all of his bravado. I picture Peter saying, all right, listen, like, y'all remind me, did anybody else get their name changed to Rock, or is it just me? Did he say that he was going to build the church on any of you guys, or was that? I thought it was just me, but I could be wrong. Remind me again. That's right. I am the Rock, right? Like, I just picture Peter being like, I clearly must be the greatest. He's not building his church on you, James. He's not building his church on you, Andrew, right? He's building his church on me. I'm the Rock. I must be the greatest, right? All right, so here's the point, right? Like, I picture the guys having this conversation, discussing greatness according to their own rubrics, their own criteria, their own understanding, right? So then they come to Capernaum, they get to the city where they're heading to, and Jesus turns around and asks them the question, right? Already knowing full well the answer to the question. He says, what were you arguing about as you walked along the way? And as I was praying with this line, I kept hearing my own mom and dad, the tone that I remember hearing as a little boy when they would ask me a question that they knew the answer to. Like, what were you doing over there to your brother? Nothing, right? Like, they knew the answer, right? What were you guys discussing as you walked along the way? I love in the gospel, the narrator comes in next, the narrator's voice. Remember, the narrator is Mark, who's telling the story from Peter's perspective, from Peter's vantage point. And I picture Peter telling Mark this, and I see Peter laughing, like, really hard as he's telling Mark this story. Kind of like, when you think back on those parts of your own life, when you think back on, I can't believe I used to do that, or I can't believe I used to think that, right? Like, you're just laughing at the kind of naivete you used to have, or the kind of, like, man, that was so dumb. What was I thinking back then, right? I picture Peter laughing and saying to him, yeah, man, we were talking about who of us was the greatest, And Mark writes it down. They were discussing amongst themselves who was the greatest. Now look, this is the part that I really want you to notice. And if you hear nothing else tonight, hear this, please. Like right at this point, we might expect Jesus to turn and wag a finger at the apostles with condemnation and just disappointment that they just clearly don't get it. But that's not how he responds. That Jesus does not rebuke them for wanting to be great. Jesus does not rebuke them in their desire for greatness. He doesn't condemn their hearts in their desire for greatness. No, he looks at them just like he looks at us, you and me right here tonight, and says yes to that desire in us to be great. He wants us to be great. But here's the thing, right? It's like here's what Jesus is trying to convey to Peter and to the apostles. It's as if he's saying, fellas, you do not know how to adequately assess greatness. That's the problem. You do not know how to adequately and rightly assess greatness or a life well lived. It's like you've got the wrong measuring equipment. You're not using the right standard of measure to it's like you're using a thermometer to measure distance. You're never going to get the right answer. It's like he's saying you do not know how to determine whether a life is great or not, whether a life was well lived or not. You're using the wrong metric. You're using the wrong criterion. You're using all the wrong benchmarks. I just imagine Peter telling this story to Mark, right? Peter now, who's an old man, this man who's been through so much, his heart's been so transformed in the 30 years after the resurrection, talking to Mark, he has seen so much, experienced so much, suffered so much, gone through so much. I picture Peter in his old age, knowing that his time is short. Nero's looking for a scapegoat. I imagine Peter telling all of this to Mark, sharing his story with him. Because I imagine Peter early on in his life, when he was still just Simon, thinking that I have to make my life great. Right? As a boy, in the ancient Jewish world, part of the ancient Jewish custom was that by the age of 12, you were invited into the school of Torah called the Bet Midrash. So this is how this worked, that the rabbis, if they thought you had the skills, the chops to actually really make a good student, to maybe become a rabbi one day, they would invite you into the school system to become, a student of the Torah. Well, here's Peter, here's Simon, if you will, now a 30-year-old man, and he's working in the fishing industry. He's a fisherman with his dad. Clearly, by the age of 12, he had already been passed over. That's a part of Simon Peter's story, that when he was a boy, he had already been told that he didn't have what it took. His notion of greatness was already shifted as a boy. I'm picturing Simon Peter, going back to his father and apprenticing to his father, learning how to fish just like every other son learned how the trade of their father. I picture Simon the day that came when he finally was able to buy his own boat. Right? He felt like a real man when he finally bought his own boat, didn't have to use his dad's boat. I'm really going to set out. I'm going to build the business. I'm going to do it in a way that's even greater than what my dad had done. And I imagine the day that he bought a second boat and a third boat, and he was really becoming something on the Sea of Galilee. People knew him. They were coming to him for advice. He had a growing business, a booming way of life. And then one day, this Galilean prophet walks along the seashore and tells him, I'm going to make you a fisher of men, and calls him. And there was something in his eyes that Peter saw, that Simon saw, that made him think, in this man, there is something indescribably great. And he's inviting me to follow him. And he dropped his nets and followed him. I just picture Simon telling all of this. And the thing is, we're still talking about Simon and the apostles, Peter and the apostles. Not because of Peter's influence in the first century Galilean fishing economy. Okay, you with me on this? I know it's obvious, but we don't remember this fisherman from Galilee because he made such an impact as a fisherman. He wasn't such a good businessman 2,000 years ago. That's not the reason why we know his name today. That's not what made him great. What made him great was the fact that he responded to Jesus' call, that he said yes to a life of pouring himself out in love and service, receiving from the Father's heart, letting go of control, all of these things, right? Like Peter became great absolutely, not by following the metrics, the benchmarks, the standards of the world, right? Acquire power, influence, notoriety, all of those things. That's not how Peter became great. Peter's greatness consisted in letting himself be led, letting himself be loved. Like the great ones of our tradition as Catholics, as Christians, the great ones who really affect the world are the little ones, the ones who live lives of vulnerability, who are willing to enter into deep relationship and love and tenderness and mercy and kindness. That's where the greatness is. That's where the power is. The great ones of our tradition aren't the ones who had massive amounts of power. Like St. John Paul the Great wasn't great because he was in charge of many people. He was great because he loved in a way that no one else at the time loved. That was the influence he had on people. Like for Christians, greatness is not about power. And that's something our world needs right now. Christians, greatness is not about power. It's about love. It's about love, which requires vulnerability, which requires receptivity. It requires intimacy. It requires, like Jesus says in the gospel, becoming like a child. Becoming like a child. And perhaps, I think this is the hardest thing. I think this is the biggest thing. Real greatness requires submitting to the poverty, if I could put it this way, submitting to the poverty of not knowing what my life actually accomplishes, if I can put it that way. I think we're all obsessed with wanting to know, has my life made an impact? What is the evidence of the greatness of my life? Has it made an impact? That's not greatness. That's narcissism. Christian greatness is submitting to the poverty of I don't need to know if my life has accomplished anything. Because if greatness is bound up in love, and love is a hidden thing, then I need to let go of needing to know where the ripples have gone. And all I'm simply asked to do is love. All I'm asked to do is love. I just want us to consider, as we go through this week, I want us to prayerfully consider, like the fact that Jesus has put this yearning in our hearts for greatness. It's a real thing. He wants us to be great. He wants you to be great. But what is the benchmark? What is the measuring stick that we're using to measure our lives? Because if it's anything but what Jesus spells out for us, if it's anything but love, we're going to be chasing after something that is not going to last. Jesus blesses that desire for greatness. He says, but let me show you the way. Let me show you the way. So Jesus, we come to you tonight with hearts that yearn for greatness. You have put that desire in us. And Lord, we submit that desire to you and ask you to redirect it to all that is true and good and beautiful. You would help us to see more clearly that a life centered on love is the most powerful life. A hidden life of sacrifice and love is the most powerful life. And Jesus, we submit our hearts and our desires for greatness to you. We ask you to smash the idols that we have in our hearts. Help us to measure true greatness against the cross. Amen.